It is one of the great paradoxes of history, how those who seem least equipped for depth, for reflection, or for conscience so often find themselves seated at the summit of power. Their speeches are empty yet applauded, their policies shallow yet enacted, and their gaze rarely inward is celebrated as decisiveness. Marie-Louise von Franz did not view this as a mere political fluke. For her, this was a psychic phenomenon, a manifestation of collective unconsciousness choosing its reflection. The fool, long a figure of ridicule in ancient courts, has ascended the throne not in jest, but with terrifying sincerity. Power, in itself, is not corrupting, but it is an amplifier, a mirror that enlarges whatever is already unresolved in the psyche. The underdeveloped individual, when placed in a position of visibility and influence, is not suddenly elevated, rather, they become possessed by their own unconscious content. Von Franz observed that foolishness, in this symbolic sense, was not about low intelligence. It was about inner emptiness and absence of symbolic life, of inner dialogue, of moral imagination. It was the person who cannot see beyond literalism, who is trapped in the outer world, while the inner world atrophies. And it is precisely such a person who finds the lure of power irresistible. The psychologically mature individual hesitates before taking command. They feel the weight of responsibility. They consult their dreams, wrestle with ambiguity, and suspect their own motives. But the fool, he charges ahead. He is certain. Certainty is the favorite mask of unconsciousness. Von Franz noted how the psyche, when ruled by ego alone, loses the capacity for symbolic perception. It forgets that all leadership is service, not self-glorification. It forgets that every throne is a symbol, and the one who occupies it must bow to something greater than themselves. History is filled with moments where the collective projects its forgotten wisdom onto a fool, mistaking charisma for consciousness, volume for vision. The fool becomes king not because he is wise, but because he is familiar. His shadow mirrors ours. We elect him, we applaud him, because we see in him our unexamined selves, our laziness, our fear of complexity, our hunger for answers without questions. Von Franz understood that this pattern is not political in essence, it is mythic. It repeats because the psyche seeks wholeness, even through catastrophe. The fool on the throne is not just a warning, he is a signal. He appears when a culture has lost its symbolic compass, when it no longer recognizes the difference between the true sage and the inflated ego. Power, to the psyche, is never neutral. It awakens something ancient energy that has always lived within the collective unconscious. To hold authority is not just to govern others, it is to step into a mythic field thick with symbols. The king, the tyrant, the trickster, these are not mere historical roles, but archetypes. Vast, invisible structures that shape how power is carried or distorted. Marie-Louise von Franz recognized that when an individual steps into leadership without self-awareness, these archetypes do not serve, they possess. The king archetype, in its healthy form, symbolizes order, blessing, and responsibility. He is the axis mundi, the psychic center that unites opposites and provides direction. But when the ego has not been tempered through inner work, the king becomes swollen, no longer a servant of the self, but a bloated image of the ego's fantasy. He forgets that true sovereignty comes from alignment with something greater than himself. In this inflated state, the king devolves into the tyrant, the dark mirror of rulership. No longer generative, he becomes devouring. He no longer governs with vision but with fear, surrounding himself with flatterers, silencing critics, and declaring his will as absolute. Von Franz saw this transformation not as a failure of intellect, but of individuation. The man possessed by the tyrant archetype has not met his own shadow. He does not know the chaos he carries within, and so he projects it outward, shaping the world into a battlefield to match his inner unrest. In this condition, he becomes less a person and more an agent of collective unconsciousness, a vessel through which the archetype acts, blind to its consequences. Then there is the trickster, whose presence and power is more subtle and more dangerous. Unlike the tyrant, the trickster hides behind charm, disruption, and humor. He confuses, deceives, and pretends not to know the rules, while skillfully bending them to his will. He appears innocent, even playful. But underneath this mask is the archetype of disintegration, the spirit that thrives on disorder, contradiction, and reversal. When an unconscious person channels the trickster, institutions unravel under the pretense of freedom. Language becomes slippery. Truth is treated as optional, and the public, seduced by entertainment and novelty, becomes complicit in its own confusion. Von Franz warned that the psyche does not care for social convenience. If the ego inflation is not mere arrogance, it is a psychological distortion with deep mythological roots and unconscious identification with something far larger than the human personality can contain. Marie-Louise von Franz, building on Jung's insights, saw inflation as the moment when the ego stops being a servant of the self and instead mistakes itself for the self. It is not just a mistake, it is a rupture in the psyche, a swelling that disconnects the individual from reality, others, and ultimately from their own soul. Power, especially public power, is a breeding ground for this condition. When a person with unresolved wounds steps into a position of visibility, they often compensate not by integrating their vulnerability but by disguising it behind control, command, or charisma. The fragile ego, hungry for validation and terrified of insignificance, clings to the illusion that its authority is absolute. In this state, the ego becomes inflated not because it has grown, but because it has filled with air, with fantasy, with the borrowed force of collective projections. The ancient Greeks called it hubris, Jung called it possession by the archetype, and von Franz saw it in her patients who were seduced by spiritual authority, intellectual superiority, or roles of influence. The inflated ego does not listen. It speaks with certainty. It surrounds itself with symbols of importance, titles, followers, rituals, anything to maintain the illusion of inner fullness. But beneath the surface lies a great emptiness, one that grows more dangerous the more it is denied. Inflation always begins with unconsciousness. The ego, detached from the grounding presence of the self, begins to orbit its own reflection. It loses the capacity for irony, humility, or genuine doubt. Criticism feels like attack. Compromise feels like betrayal. The inflated personality cannot negotiate or reflect, it must dominate or withdraw. It is brittle, not strong. It survives by manipulation, not by inner truth. Von Franz warned that in times of cultural breakdown, inflated egos rise quickly. They mirror the collective psyche's own confusion and longing for certainty. The public, unconsciously sensing power, projects its hopes onto leaders who have no true center. The result is often tragic. Nations led by children in the masks of gods, movements that promise salvation and delivered destruction. Because the inflated ego does not merely harm itself, it draws others into its unreality. The antidote is not moral correction, but inner work. True authority grows from the painful and lifelong process of meeting one's own shadow. There is a terrifying clarity in the idea that a nation's leader is not merely chosen, but psychologically summoned. Marie-Louise von Franz, with her deep sensitivity to myth and psyche, saw the ascent of foolish or dangerous individuals to power not just as a political accident, but as a symbolic phenomenon, a projection of the unacknowledged shadow of the collective. The fool on the throne, she warned, often wears the mask of the people's disowned traits: greed, vanity, cowardice, and the hunger for control. In Jungian terms, the shadow is not just what is evil or dark, but what is repressed, unseen, or denied within us. In individuals, it leads to neurosis, but when magnified by the scale of society, it becomes far more destructive. A leader who has not wrestled with their own inner demons becomes a perfect carrier of these projections. They begin to act out, unconsciously, what the collective psyche cannot yet face. This is why foolish leaders so often appear exaggerated, almost theatrical. They become symbolic figures, not merely administrators or politicians. They may speak and behave irrationally, or defy all sense of proportionate, yet still be loved or followed. Why? Because something in the collective sees itself in them, not the ideal self, but the wounded, regressive, unconscious self. The part of the psyche that would rather be told what to believe than suffer the anxiety of doubt. Von Franz noted that these figures often serve an unconscious function. They speak the unspeakable, releasing forbidden emotions: rage, resentment, envy, that have long been buried in the national soul. The leader does not invent these feelings, they release them. And in doing so, they gain a strange kind of power, a spellbinding charisma that bypasses logic and speaks directly to the archetypal layer of the psyche. The danger lies in identification. When the leader becomes indistinguishable from the people's unconscious, criticism becomes treason, and opposition feels like self-doubt. The leader may begin to believe their own myth, sinking deeper into delusion. while those who follow project more and more of their agency onto the throne. In this fusion, both parties become blind. The tragedy of such times is that wisdom is often ridiculed, and foolishness becomes sanctified. Shadow does not look like a monster. It smiles, it makes promises, it offers relief, but its gift is always double-edged. The more the shadow is projected upward, the less responsibility individuals take for their own growth, their own darkness, and in the end, the collective pays the price not just in broken institutions, but in broken souls. The human psyche, when frightened or overwhelmed, hungers for clarity. This is not a flaw, but a reflex and ancient instinct for survival. Yet in the realm of politics and power, this reflex can become fatal. Marie-Louise von Franz understood the psychic cost of complexity and the terrible allure of simplicity. When life feels chaotic, when the inner and outer worlds are too much to bear, the voice that offers an easy answer becomes magnetic, not because it is true, but because it is bearable. Foolish leaders often do not rise by accident. They rise because they speak in the language of the child, the language of certainty. They do not question, they declare. They do not reflect, they promise. Their charisma is hollow, but it echoes the inner desire for something absolute. For the masses, weary from the burden of nuance, this kind of certainty feels like relief. It is a spell woven from half-truths and the unconscious wish to be led. Von Franz warned that the psyche's shadow is not only dark but lazy. It seeks shortcuts to meaning, preferring slogans to symbols, commandments to questions. The more psychologically immature a society becomes, the more it loses tolerance for ambiguity. In such a climate, complexity is seen as weakness, humility as indecision, thoughtfulness as betrayal. The fool who speaks in absolutes begins to seem like a prophet. This seduction is deeply archetypal. The fool, when unredeemed, becomes the false savior promising paradise without sacrifice, glory without wisdom. His simplicity is infectious because it gives people permission to stop thinking, to follow, to regress. Jung knew that regression in the service of the ego is not healing, it is corruption. And when this regression becomes collective, foolishness ceases to be merely annoying, it becomes catastrophic. The danger is not just in the leader, it is in the mirror they hold up to the crowd. When the people no longer desire to be challenged, when they no longer wish to grow, they will love most the one who asks the least of them. They will confuse volume for strength, repetition for truth, and charisma for competence. They will chant back the very lies that keep them asleep. Von Franz believed that this dynamic is not political in origin, it is psychic. To break the spell of the simple answer, a person must first endure the pain of complexity. They must be willing to sit in the unknown, to wrestle with paradox, to think symbolically. Only then can they recognize true authority not in the loudest voice, but in the one that calls them to awaken. A culture that cannot tolerate depth will always mistake the fool for a king. And unless it begins the hard work of inner maturity, it will keep doing so again and again, to its own undoing. There is a deeper tragedy beneath the surface of political foolishness, one far more intimate than we care to admit. According to Marie-Louise von Franz, the external enthronement of the fool is not just a failure of institutions, it is the symptom of something quieter, something inward, a collapse of inner authority. It happens subtly, invisibly. People begin to doubt the quiet voice within, the symbolic compass of dreams, conscience, and mythic imagination. And into that hollow space, loudness enters, the outer replaces the inner. Von Franz saw this not as a political or social phenomenon, but a spiritual crisis. When people stop listening to the symbolic language of their own unconscious, when they no longer reflect on their inner images or test their actions against the depth of myth, they become susceptible to projection. The unconscious doesn't vanish, it simply relocates. It looks for an image onto which it can attach itself, and it often finds one in the shape of a leader, a hero, or a savior, who appears to speak with certainty. The less inner guidance a person has, the more power they give away to outer figures. Inner authority is a slow and subtle force. It emerges from dialogue with the self, from wrestling with dreams, from the painful honesty of shadow work. It does not shout, it whispers. It doesn't flatter the ego, it corrects it. And for this reason, it is deeply uncomfortable. But when people forsake this dialogue, when they silence the symbolic voice and ignore their own mythic threads, they begin to long for someone else to tell them who they are. And anyone will do, so long as they are convincing. This inner abandonment has a consequence. As people disconnect from their own symbolic reality, they become easier to deceive. The psyche, deprived of meaning, grabs onto the most available narrative. It loses discernment, and in doing so, elevates those who mirror its blindness. The fool on the throne is often the one most willing to impersonate authority to echo what people want to hear rather than what they need to know. And the tragedy is that this voice feels familiar. It feels like truth because it imitates the very voice they've stopped listening to within. Von Franz did not believe that awakening was collective. It begins in the singular heart, in the dreamer, who dares to look inward rather than upward. To re-establish inner authority is to begin the hard journey back, toward personal myth. It is to remember that conscience is not moralism, it is soul speaking, the voice of the deeper pattern trying to be lived. Until that voice is honored again, the outer world will keep producing leaders who reflect the absence of that very honoring. The fool appears not by chance, but by invitation from a people who have forgotten how to hear the one voice that cannot be elected or overthrown, the symbolic truth within. There is a peculiar magic in appearances, and it works most powerfully when fear and confusion cloud the collective psyche. What masquerades as strength often gains traction not because it is strong, but because it performs strength with conviction. Marie-Louise von Franz understood that the psyche can be bewitched especially when it longs for clarity, certainty, or salvation. In this vulnerable state, it mistakes bravado for courage, rigidity for resolve, and emotional blindness for rational leadership. The fool does not always stumble into power. Sometimes, he is lifted there by applause. The outer form of confidence is compelling. A voice that does not waver. A face that does not flinch. A tone that does not reflect. These are the costumes of competence, and when worn skillfully, they short-circuit the inner questioner. Many people are so weary of complexity, so tired of nuance, that they will follow the one who sounds sure regardless of what he says. Von Franz would call this symbolic failure, a collapse of the ability to see beyond surfaces, to sense the deeper archetypal forces at play. Foolishness, when hidden beneath charisma or certainty, becomes deeply dangerous because it wears the mask of heroism. The rigid mind unable to self-reflect or entertain contradiction gets mistaken for strength of character. The emotionally blind leader, cut off from empathy or imagination, is seen as practical, no-nonsense, efficient, and yet, beneath this mask lies a profound fragmentation. These are not integrated individuals, but split ones. Their certainty is not born of wisdom, but of defended ignorance. When such individuals enter power, their decisions carry the weight of their blindness. There is no dialogue with the unconscious, no symbolic reflection, only reaction. The refusal to feel becomes policy. The inability to imagine becomes law. And what was once admired as strength reveals its true nature, a brittle shell cracking under pressure. The leader who could not feel cannot adapt. The one who could not imagine cannot see danger until it is too late. Von Franz did not write politics, but her psychological lens cuts deeper than analysis. She saw that the more a culture denies its own vulnerability, the more it will elevate those who deny theirs most convincingly. This is why fools often wear crowns, not because they are wise, but because they embody the collective illusion that emotional repression and rigidity are forms of mastery. Real strength, as she knew, is something else entirely. It is inner coherence, the ability to hold conflict without collapse, to feel deeply without drowning, to lead without possession. But that kind of strength is quiet, often hidden, and rarely seductive to a culture obsessed with display. Until that changes, the fool in armor will keep marching forward loud, unyielding, and disastrously sure of himself. In times of psychic collapse, it is often the feminine voice that speaks first, quietly, symbolically, and with unsettling accuracy. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this not in the socio-political sense alone, but in the deeper archetypal field where intuition, ambiguity, and relationship reside. These are not merely female traits in a biological sense, but qualities long associated with the feminine principle in symbolic life, and they are often the first to be silenced when foolishness ascends the throne. Fools in power fear what they cannot control. The feminine, by its very nature, defies control. It sees around corners, It speaks not in declarations, but in symbols, feelings, and paradoxes. It asks questions where the fool demands answers, and so it is mocked, diminished, or simply ignored, not because it is weak, but because it is terrifyingly attuned to what lies beneath the surface. A warning whispered by a woman, whether through myth, dream, or embodied insight, is rarely heeded in regimes governed by the inflated ego. It is often dismissed as hysteria, oversensitivity, or weakness, when in fact it is precisely the medicine needed to prevent collapse. Von Franz saw how the feminine voice, both within men and women, carries a kind of ancient intelligence, one that does not pretend to know, but listens deeply. It sees the interconnection of things. It recognizes pattern and consequence. In its mature form, it is not emotional chaos, but moral depth. And yet, in systems built on bravado and denial, such wisdom is rarely welcome. The more fragile the psyche of the leader, the more he must prove himself against this inner feminine. What cannot be integrated must be repressed. And what is repressed eventually returns, first as warning, then as tragedy. History offers no shortage of examples. Women who warned of coming wars, silenced; intuitive thinkers, dismissed in boardrooms; artists and analysts whose visions of coming collapse were too unsettling to be taken seriously. In each case, the voice of the feminine was not just ignored, it was ridiculed, scapegoated, or pathologized. And in each case, the consequences unfolded exactly as predicted. This is not a call to idolize women, nor to claim that intuition is always right. Von Franz was not naive. She knew that even the feminine principle can be distorted. But what she feared most was a world in which it was not even permitted to speak. For when we lose access to that voice, whether in the culture or within ourselves, we lose the ability to feel where we are, to sense what is coming, and to respond with depth. The silencing of the feminine is not merely a cultural failure, it is a psychic wound, and in the absence of that wisdom, the fool grows louder, more sure of himself, more dangerous, until, at last, in times of uncertainty, people do not seek complexity, they seek clarity, even if it is false. Into this collective hunger steps the figure of the leader, cloaked in the garments of the hero. But this is not the hero of myth who journeys into the underworld to confront the self. It is a counterfeit hero, inflated by projection, summoned not from depth but from desperation. Marie-Louise von Franz saw this pattern unfold repeatedly in history, and she understood that when a society loses contact with its inner myth, it begins to outsource salvation. Projection is not a flaw of the psyche, it is a function. We all carry within us the image of the hero, the one who overcomes, protects, leads. But when this archetype is unconscious, it seeks a vessel outside the self. We long for someone to embody our disowned strength, our buried resolve. And so we elect, follow, or worship a person who seems to match the silhouette of our forgotten inner potential. The more broken we feel inside, the more perfect that projection must appear. But no human can bear the weight of an archetype without becoming distorted. The leader becomes inflated, no longer a person but a screen for collective fantasy. And we, in turn, become passive, believing the battle is theirs to fight, the truth theirs to speak. The inner hero, who should be confronting our own shadow, is exiled. In his place stands a figure who plays the part with conviction but no soul. Von Franz warned that the danger is not merely that the leader is foolish, it is that we have given him power by refusing our own. We mistake confidence for wisdom, slogans for insight, dominance for courage. The counterfeit hero rises because we prefer mythic comfort to psychic work. We want deliverance, not initiation. And so we don't see the signs, the lack of depth, the avoidance of nuance, the fragile ego masked by spectacle. We are enchanted. And in that enchantment, we collude. The moment of awakening often comes too late, when promises collapse, when consequences arrive, when the mask slips and we see the fool who never intended to lead, only to be adored. The psychological betrayal cuts deep, not because the leader failed us, but because we failed to recognize our own need for projection. The hero we longed for was never external. He was the part of ourselves we had refused to awaken, and in trying to avoid the inner journey, we handed our fate to someone who could not take it. To withdraw the projection is painful. It demands that we take back what we gave away: our courage, our insight, our responsibility. But only then can we begin the real work, not of finding the hero, but becoming him. Von Franz knew this was the only cure for mass foolishness. The slow, humbling realization that the myth we seek out there has always been waiting in here. When the structures we once trusted begin to crack, something strange often happens. Not silence, but laughter; not wisdom, but mockery. History has a peculiar rhythm, and just before the collapse of rigid systems, the trickster returns. He does not arrive with answers but with disruption. He doesn't build, he undoes. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this archetype intimately, not as a comic aside but as a psychic necessity. In moments of collective stagnation, the trickster emerges to expose the hollowness we no longer wish to see. The trickster is not evil. He is not even necessarily stupid. He is chaotic, amoral, contradictory, a figure who defies order and logic not to destroy meaning, but to challenge its false versions. When the world has become too controlled, too moralistic, too certain in its own righteousness, the trickster destabilizes that illusion. He exposes the hypocrisy, reveals the lies, says aloud what was politely repressed, but he does it in a way that disorients. He wears a smile while he pulls the floor out from under us. Von Franz saw the trickster as a psychic pressure valve. When a culture becomes too rigid, too inflated in its ideals, or too dead in its institutions, the unconscious releases this archetype to stir the pot. In mythology, it is Loki who introduces mischief into the solemn halls of the gods. It is Hermes who steals and lies, and yet still guides souls to the underworld. These figures are not anomalies, they are recurring messages from the deep layers of the psyche. And when they appear in our leaders or our cultural icons, it is not an accident, it is a signal. The trickster in modern form might be the loud politician who makes a mockery of civility, the influencer who ridicules depth, or the public figure who says the unsayable just to provoke. At first, we laugh. Then we're disturbed, but often, we cannot look away. That is the paradox. The trickster reveals the unconscious hunger for disruption that society itself has repressed. He says, "Look how fragile your truths are. Look how easily your moral superiority collapses under pressure." He is not here to fix anything. He is here to make the need for change undeniable. But von Franz also warned that to mistake the trickster for a savior is its own form of stupidity. The trickster initiates collapse. He does not build the new. His gift is psychic clarity through chaos, not sustainable reform. When people project hope onto the trickster, they will be betrayed. And yet, if they refuse to hear his message, they will be destroyed. The challenge is to decode his madness, to ask what the chaos is pointing toward, what stagnant order is being dismantled, and what shadow truth has come to the surface. Laughing, the trickster's return is not the end. There is a quiet tragedy woven into the structure of civilization. Those most suited to lead rarely desire power, and those who crave power are often the least equipped to carry its weight. Marie-Louise von Franz saw this not as a quirk of politics, but as a deep psychological and symbolic truth. Power, when pursued for its own sake, attracts the ego that seeks inflation, not service. Wisdom, on the other hand, inclines inward toward depth, responsibility, and the unbearable burden of consciousness. And so, we find ourselves repeatedly ruled by those who mistake ambition for strength, while the truly wise walk quietly in the background. In many myths and fairy tales, the rightful ruler is not the one who seizes the throne, but the one who resists it, who doubts their worthiness, who has walked through suffering, who has made peace with their own shadow. These are the figures who undergo a transformation before they rule. They don't command authority, they carry it, almost reluctantly. Jung would say they are individuals in whom the ego has been tempered by the self. They have met the inner dragon and survived. But our modern systems rarely reward this kind of psychological development. They favor certainty over reflection, sound bites over silence. And so, the stage is left to those who perform best, not those who listen most deeply. Power becomes theater. Leadership becomes an extension of ego. The wise retreat, not because they are indifferent, but because they understand the cost. To hold true power is to carry the responsibility of the collective soul. That burden requires a strength that is quiet, invisible, and almost always misunderstood. Von Franz believed that the soul resists inflation. The deeper one travels into the unconscious, the less interested one becomes in controlling others. Wisdom makes one cautious. It introduces paradox, ambiguity, and reverence for mystery. The foolish cannot bear this complexity. They reduce life to slogans. They turn governance into a mirror of their own unexamined hunger, and the people, often equally disoriented by complexity, follow them not because they trust the content, but because they are seduced by the tone. And so a split emerges. Wisdom without power retreats into monasteries, journals, and late-night reflections. Power without wisdom ascends the stage, intoxicated by applause. It is a psychic imbalance made visible in every collapsing empire, every failed revolution. The question is not simply why fools rise. It is why the wise so often choose silence. Perhaps the task now is not to convince the wise to seek power, but to change our definition of what power truly is. Not command, but communion. Not domination, but depth. The leaders we need will not look like the leaders we have known. They will emerge not with grandiosity,